Happy Memorial Day, everybody. In honor of the occasion, I'm taking a look at Men of Valor for PC and Xbox. What you're seeing here is the PC version. This is a first-person shooter developed by 2015 Inc. and originally published by Vivendi Universal, although Nordic Games now publishes it. And it was released in October of 2004 for Xbox first and then for PC a bit later on, and it went on to receive fairly mixed reviews. At least that's what the critics thought at the time, and you did see a noticeable divide between the Xbox players and the PC players, because the Xbox players generally seem to enjoy it a bit more. So let's go ahead and delve into this thing and find out just how it is as a first-person shooter, how it is as a sort of kind of follow-up to Medal of Honor Allied Assault, because that's what 2015 Inc. is known for. But more importantly, how it is as a Vietnam War game, because let's face it, there aren't very many of those, and most of them are pretty awful. So let's go ahead and delve right into this thing and find out exactly how it is. Well, as far as presentation goes, the best two-word summary I can come up with is pretty awful. You have to keep in mind that this game was released the same year that Doom 3, Far Cry, and Half-Life 2 were released. And this was on Unreal Engine 2 and didn't even use it well at all. So it actually looked pretty awful. You got very low-res textures, you've got rather janky modeling and really terrible animations that often glitch all over the place. So it's not at all uncommon to see NPCs gliding across the ground as they just end up jerking into a certain spot, or seeing limbs twist unnaturally or even clip through the models, which looks terrible. And there's plenty of instances where things will clip through the environments as well, so generally speaking you're dealing with visuals that are not remotely impressive, and the game actually doesn't have particularly great performance either. Now specifically it's in two areas. First, if you have VSync enabled, then for some baffling reason it actually screws up the frame rate and makes it constantly hitch. I have a clip here to show you, of course, to give you an idea of what that looks like. And the only way I could actually get it to not use VSync is by going into my graphics card settings and manually setting that particular program to not run with VSync enabled. Now, of course, that's a pretty easy fix if you know where the setting is, but if you don't know where it is, and if you don't know that the game actually needs that setting, then you're going to start up the game, it's going to have severe frame rate hitching, and you're going to go, what the hell's going on here? The second area you run into performance issues with isn't so much the performance of the game itself as the responsiveness of the controls. Movement is somewhat slow, but otherwise works fine. It's just that when you're trying to aim at things with the mouse, then it just kind of feels floaty. It's a bit difficult to describe. But you'll see in certain clips here where I'm trying to aim at things and I'm just overshooting or undershooting it, and that's actually because the mouse just didn't feel right. It would either go too fast or it'd be too jerky or something like that, and I wasn't entirely sure why. And that was in no small part due to the fact that that would only pop up every so often. I'm really not sure at all what causes it, but it does happen occasionally, and it is pretty annoying. Of course, it's not a game-breaking issue, but it will get on your nerves after a while. Once you get beyond the visuals and the odd frame rate and mouse hitching issues that you'll see in this thing, you end up in the sound design department where things go wildly all over the place. On the one hand, you have the voice acting, which is relatively solid except for the fact that they repeat the same handful of phrases over and over and over again without any real variety whatsoever. You didn't think you would be able to get tired of the phrase pop some caps or get some until you've heard it repeated over and over and over again at least around 20 times in the span of about 2 minutes. And this happens every single level. It gets incredibly tiring incredibly quickly, and it eventually becomes incredibly annoying. Similarly, the music gets incredibly tiring when you hear the same tune repeated over and over and over again in just about every single mission. Which is a shame because the music itself, if you just take it on its own, is actually fairly good. It's actually by Enon Zur, apparently. But it's just not utilized very well, and more importantly, it just ends up feeling incredibly generic. The vast majority of it feels like it'd be right at home in a World War II shooter rather than a Vietnam War shooter. And then there's the attempts to make it Asian that sound incredibly generic. So other than that one tune that will get embedded in your brain simply because it plays it constantly, then you're really not going to find all that much memorable about the soundtrack. But then there's the worst offender, the sound effects, which are just terrible. There's no other way to describe them. The sound quality itself is rather low. Guns don't sound very good at all. In fact, a lot of them sound almost exactly the same. None of them really have anywhere near enough oomph, and what you end up with is sound effects that are low quality, and they are just not good to begin with. So the sound effects just end up holding the game back more than anything else. It's actually pretty impressive to see just how crap the presentation of this game is. But you know what? That's all the PC version. If you're playing the Xbox version, you also have the wonderful issue of it being lower res, which means that you're going to have issues actually being able to see the enemy in the foliage, because the foliage is actually pretty dense. So, while it is pretty difficult to actually see them in the PC version, it's even worse in the Xbox version. So there is that. But of course what really matter here are the story and the gameplay, and the story in this is that you play as Dean Shepard, who is a new soldier in Vietnam, and you end up just going through a series of battles. So you end up doing things like Khe Sanh or the Tet Offensive. And at every single opportunity, it makes sure that you know that Dean is a black man. I'm really not entirely sure why they decided to go this route, but they shoehorn that into just about every single level at some point. Whether it's just a passing reference or it's constantly popping up, it is incredibly annoying. Because here's the thing. You can make a race story regarding Vietnam. The problem is that the only real race story that's going to come up with that is when the soldier gets back from Vietnam. When they're already over there, it doesn't really matter. At that point, they were all just soldiers, and nobody really gave too much of a crap about the color of their skin. They were far more concerned with other things, like avoiding booby traps or avoiding getting shot. And that's ultimately what you end up doing in this game as well, but when they try to shoehorn race in at just about every opportunity possible, it just wears on you. You're just sitting there like, why did you do this? You could have focused on any number of things other than the fact that he's black. In fact, they should have done that because everything else related to the Vietnam War feels like it's ripped directly from Vietnam War movies. And not in the same way that, say, Call of Duty did it, where it took scenes that were in movies and basically did its own thing with them. No, in Men of Valor, it basically uses them as an opportunity to throw in as much cliched bullshit as they possibly can. Squad member getting killed by a booby trap, then going berserk on the local populace? Check. Chopper gunner yelling, "Get some! Get some!" as he mows down Vietnamese in the rice fields? Check. Segment where you crawl around in the tunnels? Check. Ambushes up the wazoo? You got it. And ultimately that's really the problem with the writing. It feels like they just threw in a bunch of stuff to fill checkboxes rather than actually make something compelling. And what you end up with is a story that comes across as contrived nonsense more than anything else. In fact, at certain times it even feels kind of jingoistic. Not very often, but it does come up that way sometimes. And in general, it just kind of reeks of what I like to call Medal of Honor syndrome. If you've played any of the Medal of Honor games, you will know this, but they really focus more on spectacle than anything else. What do I mean by that? Well, I mean that they didn't really care about the reality of the war so much as they care about recreating these massive, sweeping movie scenes. And that's exactly what they did, except that that brings the really nasty problem of the writing being very, very shallow. The same kind of thing happens here, except they didn't even succeed on the spectacle part. The actual spectacle of the war isn't really shown in very good detail in this, and you don't really get these huge, awesome scenes like you could in, say, Full Metal Jacket, or, say, Apocalypse Now, or something like that. So what you end up with is a game that's trying to focus on the spectacle, but failing miserably at it, and ultimately making its writing be even more shallow than it really seemed like it was to begin with. And when the writing's not simply being cliched and shallow, it's being nonsensical. Like, for example, giving your player character some actual character, not by showing it during actual gameplay or having him say anything during actual gameplay, but having him write letters to his folks in between missions. Which means that when you're actually playing the game, he's not saying a thing, and when you go into the loading sequences for the next level, it's going to be like, hey, now you're going to get characterization! But instead of it actually getting you attached to Dean, instead it makes you go, well, why did you even bother writing him as a character if he's going to be a silent protagonist who is simply player one the entire game? You end up having this weird dichotomy between Dean supposedly having his own character, but his character in the actual game being limited to being the ultimate badass that player one is. Well, if the game lets you be an ultimate badass anyway. You see, the first thing you learn upon booting this game up and trying to play it is that the difficulty ranges between way too easy and ludicrously difficult. There is no in between. On one end of the spectrum, the enemy AI is, well, look at it. It's terrible. As you can see, sometimes it's like shooting fish in a barrel. You can just easily pick them off with no effort whatsoever. And then there's other times where this will happen. What was even more fun than that was when I was in the tunnel segment and there were enemies shooting at me before I was even in their field of vision. Apparently the Vietnamese either have X-ray vision or are totally clairvoyant, which would explain why they won the war, I guess, but anyway. The AI problems also extend to your friendlies, but in those particular cases at least they're immortal, so luckily you don't have to worry too much about them. What you do need to worry about, however, is the incredibly inconsistent hit registration and damage modeling. Sometimes you can shoot an enemy in the foot and they'll die instantly, but if you shoot them repeatedly in the face with a 7.62 rifle, they don't go down until you've put about 5 or 6 rounds into them. It is completely all over the place. And it actually gets to the point where you actually need to worry about how much ammo you have. Keep in mind, you can have about 500 rounds for your weapons individually. And believe it or not, you can actually still run out of ammo with them. Of course, that also depends on how accurate the various weapons you're using are. The machine guns and the SMGs are all incredibly inaccurate, just spray bullets everywhere. The assault rifles, if you put them on full auto, spray bullets everywhere. If you put anything on semi-automatic, then you can get some degree of accuracy out of them, but it's not the kind of accuracy you'd really hope for. Instead of using iron sights, like was becoming more popular for games at that time, it uses that awkward zoom mechanic where it zooms in and it makes things a bit more accurate, but at the same time, it's still a matter of chance. You're still using a crosshair, not actually using weapon sights, and thus you don't get quite as much precision out of your shots as you would in, say, Call of Duty or something like that. But generally, you're going to have to put multiple rounds into the target anyway, so you don't really need precision so much as you need fast follow-up shots that aren't horribly inaccurate. That means you can pretty much rule out machine guns entirely, and you'll basically be using nothing but rifles unless you're feeling adventurous. But regardless of which weapon you're actually using, none of them are actually satisfying to use. The enemies can range from going down in one shot to going down in maybe 5 to 10 shots, just depends on the situation. This makes you feel like all the weapons you're using are pretty much exactly the same, and they're all pretty much pea shooters. And the generally pretty weak sound reinforces that. But once you get past the core shooting mechanics being incredibly lackluster at best, what you find is that the rest of the game isn't any better. The health system in particular is downright horrible. You'll notice a gold caduceus in the bottom left corner of the screen. That's your health meter. Whenever you take damage, you'll notice that part of it fills up with a kind of bright red. This means that that bit has been damaged and it will gradually deplete over time unless you hold down the bandage button, in which case it will slowly fill that back up with the gold. The gold is your actual health, and so when that gets drained all the way to nothing, you die. The problem is that there's not really much rhyme or reason to the amount of damage you take, and whenever you get hit, you basically have to drop everything you're doing to lay prone so you don't get hit again, or at least you hopefully don't get hit again, so you can bandage yourself up. And even once you've bandaged yourself up, you're still not going to have full health. You're only going to have however much the game decided was enough for that particular hit that you took. And there's basically no rhyme or reason to it. You can get shot with a pistol or a rifle and take the exact same amount of damage. Or you can get shot with a pistol once and it do barely any damage to you, and get shot again later on down the line, and all of a sudden half your health is gone from one shot. It is ridiculously inconsistent. And even if you bandage something up, you're still going to have a part of your health meter missing, so the way you replenish that is by finding canteens, which you can just loot off of dead bodies, or you can find medic kits, which are also on dead bodies, but you can also just find these things scattered around the environments. Sometimes. And once again, this basically grinds the game to a screeching halt when you're looking for a corpse that you can loot so you can hopefully get a canteen from them and get some health back, only to lose it all in one shot again later on down the line. It is incredibly frustrating to deal with this health system. And to make matters worse, half the time you can't even see where the enemy is because the foliage is too dense and they're hiding behind something, or they're able to hit you from an angle that isn't even really possible. And that's where the level design starts to become very problematic, because not only do you have these health kits scattered all over the place, and the enemy's able to hit you from seemingly impossible angles to where you can't even see them, but you'll have enemies just spawn in from the walls themselves, because this is an incredibly linear game, where every single place you are is a friggin' corridor. Or if it's not a corridor, it's just a slightly open space that's an obvious combat arena, and then it immediately goes to another corridor. I don't know about you guys, but when I think of Vietnam jungle, I don't think these very, very neat paths. And the linearity of this game just drags it down considerably, because even when you do get a branching path, you'll be like, yay, a branching path! There's some degree of freedom, only to find that both of the paths lead to the exact same spot. Or even better, you'll try to go down one of those paths, or you'll try to go past a certain spot, and it'll be like, you are abandoning your mission! You must turn back! It's like Final Fantasy XIII in that regard. The only way to escape the hallway is to stop playing the game. Because otherwise, the game is just going to keep you exactly where it wants you to be. And apparently where it wants you to be is doing the same handful of extremely repetitive objectives over and over and over again for its roughly 10 to 15 hour campaign. Maybe less if you play it on easy mode and turn on God mode the entire time. But even if you do that, you're going to still be subjected to some cardinal sins of first-person shooter design. Arbitrarily making you walk extremely slowly for no discernible reason. And then after that, maybe you get a short segment of gameplay, or maybe you just get yet another cutscene. Or maybe both of these things happen. Regardless, it is impossible to escape the fact that this is an incredibly linear, incredibly crappy first-person shooter. They do try to spice a few things up here and there. For example, they'll give you a turret segment that's a bit different from what you've been doing before, except that the weapons still don't handle particularly well and you don't feel like it's any fun at all. Which means that the game alternates between being basically infuriating and just simply boring. And the entire time, you're feeling like the game is trying to preach something to you, but it doesn't even really know what it's trying to preach in the first place. I mean, hell, it's not even well made. The amount of bugs and glitches you'll run into is pretty horrendous. In fact, I ran into one very, very early in the game. It had to have been maybe mission 3 or 4, where I actually could not progress because the script didn't trigger properly. And when that glitched out, I actually couldn't even die for some baffling reason because I wanted to reset the last checkpoint, but it wouldn't let me die, so I couldn't. And that was actually especially infuriating because the checkpoints in this game are so few and far between that you may actually have to play through huge swaths of the level over and over and over again because you keep dying. It is incredibly unforgiving in that regard. But you know what the really sad part is? This is one of the better Vietnam War shooters out there. It's actually kind of mind-bending just how few Vietnam War shooters got made, and how nearly all of them are downright terrible. And while this sounds odd to say, At least this one's just bad and not downright terrible. Although that's mostly going off the single player. I can't speak for the multiplayer because there's really no way to get into a game anymore. If you try to go into the multiplayer component, you're not going to find any servers, and even then, there are so few people who even seem to know this game exists anymore that I can't really say I'm surprised. And while I do appreciate Nordic Games bringing it back and making it available to the general public again, because let's face it, no game deserves to be forgotten, this one just doesn't deserve to be played. Although it does give us a very valuable lesson in terms of gaming itself. This is what happens when you take the Medal of Honor formula and remove the spectacle. And honestly, the only reason I can imagine people actually being attached to it is nostalgia. It came out when a lot of gamers were at a very impressionable age and didn't really understand what made a game good. But more importantly, it came out at just the right time to be a refreshing take on the military shooter genre in that it wasn't yet another World War II shooter. A lot of people would be willing to cut it some slack because of things like that. I don't. I give it a 1.5 out of 5. Thanks for watching.